The sun was already dipping low over the plains when Clara Dawson heard the approaching hoofbeats. The sound made her heart pound, not from excitement but dread. For 3 months she'd known this day would come, the day the rancher who owned nearly half the county would ride up and take what was left of her father's life's work. The Dawson farmhouse stood, small but proud against the endless prairie. Its porch creaked with every gust of wind, and the barn leaned slightly from years of neglect. Inside, Clara's hands were rough from mending fences, her dress patched more times than she could count. Still, she had kept it together, the chickens fed, the garden growing, and her mother's grave tended with wildflowers. It was all she had left, and she intended to fight for it, even if she had no weapon but her words. When James Callahan dismounted from his black horse, he looked like a man carved from the very land he ruled. Tall, broad-shouldered, his hat shadowing sharp eyes that missed nothing. Everyone in town knew his name. They said he built his fortune from sweat, but held his heart in a vault of stone since his wife's death. Clara had never spoken to him before, but she'd heard the whispers, "He never forgives a debt. He never gives second chances." "Miss Dawson," he greeted, his voice deep, even. "You received notice, I trust?" Clara nodded, clutching the folded paper she'd read so many times it had worn soft at the creases. "I did. But please, Mr. Callahan, there must be another way." He took a slow step closer, scanning the worn fences, the sagging roof, the small figure standing between him and the land. "The debt's been overdue for months. The law doesn't leave much room for mercy." Her chin lifted, trembling but steady. Maybe not the law, but a man could. That struck him. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Not quite surprise, not quite anger. "You think I'm here to be cruel?" "I think you're here to take my home," she replied simply. "And that's cruel enough." Silence fell between them, broken only by the restless snort of his horse. James had faced outlaws, storms, and hard bargains, but never a girl who looked him dead in the eye like that. Most people bowed their heads when he spoke. She didn't. He followed her gaze to the fields, thin, half-green with the last of summer's growth. She had worked this land herself, he realized. No man's tracks marked the soil, only hers. Her small hands had held a farm together longer than anyone could have expected. He stepped onto the porch, testing the boards. "You live here alone?" "My father's gone. My mother's been gone longer." Her voice caught, then steadied. "It's just me now." James nodded slowly, then looked back toward the road. He hadn't come here for sentiment. Land was land, and business was business. But something in Clara's words, the quiet strength beneath her fear, unsettled him. He'd seen desperation before. This was different. This was courage dressed in rags. When he finally spoke, his tone was softer. "You've got spirit, Miss Dawson. But spirit doesn't pay bills." She met his gaze, eyes glimmering with tears she refused to let fall. "Then I'll find a way to earn it back. I'll work for you. I'll do anything, just don't take my home." James turned away, hiding the conflict in his expression. The law doesn't work that way, but as he rode off into the fading light, the echo of her plea followed him across the plains. "Please don't take my home." That night, long after he returned to his empty mansion and poured himself a glass of whiskey, her voice still lingered. For the first time in years, James Callahan felt something other than the cold comfort of success. He felt mercy trying to take root, and though he didn't yet know it, Clara Dawson's words had already begun to change the course of both their lives. The next morning dawned cold and clear over the Callahan ranch, but James Callahan felt anything but clear-minded. He stood by his window, coffee cooling in his hand, watching his men saddle horses for the day's work. Everything was as it should be, orderly, efficient, profitable. And yet, the only thing he could see in his mind's eye was the poor farmhouse at the edge of his land, and the girl standing in front of it with her chin lifted in defiance. He had dealt with hundreds of families who'd fallen behind on payments. None of them had stayed in his thoughts past the time it took to sign a paper. But Clara Dawson had looked at him like she could see right through the man everyone else called ruthless. She hadn't begged like a coward. She had pleaded like someone who still believed decency existed, even in men like him. James set his cup down and walked out to the corral. His foreman, Eli Turner, was waiting with a ledger. "Morning, boss," Eli said, passing the book over. "Cattle count's solid. The Dawson property will add another good stretch to the north fence. You still plan to claim it by week's end?" James hesitated, running a thumb along the edge of the pages. "That was the plan." Eli raised a brow. "Was?" "Just thinking." James closed the ledger. "The girl, she's alone. No help, no kin left. She's still working that land like she owns it." "That's because she thinks she does." Eli chuckled softly. "You can't let a girl's tears get in the way of good business, James. Sentiment don't feed cattle." James's jaw tightened. He didn't like being reminded that the world ran on hard rules. "I didn't say I was changing anything," he muttered. But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. After Eli rode off to check the herd, James stayed behind, his thoughts heavy. He had spent years building his ranch from nothing, brick by brick, acre by acre. He'd buried a wife in the process, a woman he'd loved more than he'd ever admit aloud. Since then, he'd learned that feelings only cost a man what he couldn't afford to lose again. So he'd locked his heart behind the fences he built, both around his land and within himself. But Clara Dawson's face had slipped through those fences as if they weren't even there. That afternoon, James tried to distract himself with contracts, feed orders, and accounts. Yet every number blurred into the shape of that small farmhouse. When he caught himself staring out the window again, he cursed under his breath, grabbed his hat, and strode to the stable. "Going somewhere, boss?" one of the stable hands asked. "Just checking a boundary line," James said shortly. But deep down, he knew it was a lie. The ride to the Dawson property took less than an hour. The autumn air bit sharp against his cheeks, and the land stretched wide and golden around him. As he approached the farmhouse, he saw Clara in the field, mending a broken fence post. Her sleeves were rolled up, her hair tied back, her hands blistered, but she worked like she belonged there. She looked up when she heard the horse, shielding her eyes from the sun. "Come to make sure I'm gone already, Mr. Callahan?" James dismounted slowly, unsure how to answer. "No," he said finally. "I came to see if you were managing." Her lips curved in a tired half-smile. "You mean if I've given up yet?" He met her gaze and felt something tighten in his chest. "Maybe I just wanted to see if there's another way." Clara frowned, uncertain. "Another way?" James took a step closer, his voice low, thoughtful. "I don't know what that means yet, but I'll figure it out for the first time." His tone didn't sound like a man speaking to a debtor. It sounded like a man making a promise, one he didn't fully understand. As he rode away that evening, the sun setting behind him, James Callahan realized that Clara Dawson wasn't just a complication. She was a mirror, showing him the man he used to be before the world hardened him, and deep down, he knew that before long, her fight to keep her home might become his fight too. The following morning dawned gray and heavy, clouds rolling over the plains as though mirroring Clara Dawson's heart. She had been awake since before sunrise, her hands raw from mending fences that no longer belonged to her. The notice nailed to her barn door said she had 3 days left to vacate the land. 3 days to lose her father's legacy, her home, her sense of belonging. Still, she worked. She always worked. The soil under her nails, the wind on her face. Those were things no man could take, even if he took everything else. She was driving the last nail into a fence post when the low thud of hooves reached her ears again. Her stomach sank. Only one man rode that way, James Callahan, the rancher who could erase her world with a single signature. When he appeared at the edge of the pasture, his dark horse cutting through the dust, Clara's pulse quickened. Not from fear this time, but something else. Something she didn't want to name. He stopped a few feet away, dismounted, and approached slowly. His hat cast a shadow over his eyes, but his voice was calm. "You're still here," he said. "I told you I would be," Clara replied, wiping her hands on her skirt. "Until they drag me off, this is still my home," James exhaled, almost smiling. "You've got more grit than most men I know." "Grit doesn't pay debts, Mr. Callahan." Her words stung, not for their sharpness, but for their truth. He glanced at the fields. Her careful rows of corn, her patched barn roof, her defiance written in every act of survival. Then he looked at her, thin, proud, beautiful, in a quiet, weary way that made something in his chest ache. "I didn't come to argue," he said finally. "I came to make you an offer." Clara crossed her arms, suspicious. "If it's about the land, I've told you. I can't sell what's already been taken." He shook his head. "It's not about selling. It's about keeping it." Her brow furrowed. "Keeping it?" James nodded, choosing his words carefully. "You said you'd do anything to hold on to this place." "I've been thinking about that." Clara's pulse quickened again. There was something in his tone. Serious, not cruel, but personal. "What exactly are you saying?" He stepped closer, his voice low but steady. "If you become my wife, the land stays yours. You won't owe me a cent. You'll have a home, this one, and protection under my name." For a moment, the world went still. Clara just stared at him, too stunned to speak. "Marry you?" she whispered. "Mr. Callahan, that's not a business offer." "No," he said quietly. "It isn't." Her cheeks flushed with confusion and something close to anger. "Why would you do that?" "Out of pity?" His eyes met hers, dark and unreadable. "Out of respect. And maybe something I don't have a name for yet." The wind picked up between them, carrying the scent of dry grass and storm. Clara turned away, trying to gather her thoughts. "You don't even know me," she said softly. "I know enough," James replied. "You work harder than anyone I've met. You've lost everything and still fight like it's not over. That kind of strength doesn't go unnoticed." She shook her head, torn between disbelief and a strange flicker of hope. "You'd tie yourself to a woman like me just so I can keep my home?" James stepped forward until he was only a breath away. "Maybe I'm tired of living in a house that's never felt like one," he murmured. "Maybe you're not the only one who needs saving." The words hung between them, unexpected, unpolished, real. Clara's heart pounded as thunder rolled in the distance. She didn't say yes, but she didn't walk away either, and as James turned to leave, tipping his hat with a faint nod, both of them knew something had already changed, something neither could undo. The wedding came faster than either of them expected, or truly wanted to admit. There were no flowers, no music, and no smiles. Only the dusty air of Dry Creek's small chapel and the echo of vows spoken more out of necessity than love. Clara Dawson stood before James Callahan, wearing the only dress she owned, a pale blue one, carefully washed and mended for the occasion. Her hands trembled as she held them together, but her chin stayed high. She had told herself that marrying him was survival, nothing more. A way to keep her father's home and her mother's memory alive. Yet as she looked at the man across from her, tall and solemn, she couldn't tell if she was saving her home or losing her freedom. James wore his best black coat, the same one he'd worn to his wife's funeral years before. It wasn't superstition that made him choose it. It was the truth that he owned no other. He said the vows clearly, his deep voice steady but emotionless, as though he were signing another business deal. When the preacher finally said, "You may kiss the bride," James hesitated. For a long second, the silence between them thickened. Then, with polite restraint, he bowed his head and brushed his lips against her forehead, a gesture more of respect than affection. Clara's eyes stayed open. The preacher smiled awkwardly, pronounced them husband and wife, and sent them on their way. Outside, the town was quiet. Only a few curious eyes peered through windows. Folks would talk. The poor girl who married the richest man in the county just to keep her roof. But Clara didn't care what they said. She told herself she'd made her choice with her head, not her heart. The carriage ride to the Callahan ranch was long and silent. The sky had turned a warm gold, the fields glowing with evening light. Clara sat stiffly, hands folded in her lap while James guided the reins. He wanted to say something, anything, to make it less cold between them, but he'd forgotten how to speak kindly to another soul. When they reached the ranch house, Clara's breath caught. The place was enormous compared to her farmhouse. Wide porches, tall windows, the scent of horses and cedar in the air. It was beautiful, but it felt foreign, not hers. James helped her down, his touch gentle but distant. "You'll have the east room," he said. "You can make it your own. Mrs. Green, the housekeeper, will show you where things are." Clara nodded, forcing politeness. "Thank you, Mr. Callahan." He frowned slightly. "It's James now. You're my wife." The words felt strange on her tongue. "All right, James." That night, she sat alone in her new room, staring at the strange furniture and walls that didn't carry her father's laughter or her mother's prayers. She took off her wedding ring and turned it in her fingers. It was too big, too cold, and far too heavy. Downstairs, James sat by the fire, glass of whiskey untouched. He'd thought marriage might ease something inside him, a sense of loneliness that had grown over the years like drought across the land. But instead, the silence of the house felt even louder now, filled with the knowledge that a woman was under his roof who didn't love him, and maybe never would. In the days that followed, Clara threw herself into work, helping in the kitchen, tending the garden, mending curtains. She was determined not to be a burden. James kept his distance, always polite, always measured. They shared meals but not conversation, glances but not warmth. Two strangers bound by law and circumstance, one proud, one haunted, learning to live side by side in a house that felt like anything but a home. And yet, in the quiet spaces between duty and silence, something unspoken began to stir, like the first fragile shoots of spring after a long, hard winter. The first weeks of their marriage passed like slow-moving clouds, quiet, heavy, and distant. Clara Dawson Callahan kept herself busy from dawn till dark. She scrubbed floors that were already clean, cooked for men who barely spoke, and tended the small garden behind the big house as if her life depended on it. And perhaps it did. Work was easier than thinking. James Callahan, meanwhile, kept to his routines, rising early, riding out to the cattle, and returning late, covered in dust. He never raised his voice, never demanded anything, but his silence filled the halls heavier than words ever could. To the ranch hands, their new marriage was a curiosity. They whispered about the rich man who'd married the poor farmer's daughter out of nowhere. Some said pity drove him. Others thought pride. But no one dared ask him, and no one dared mock her, because even if the bride was poor, she carried herself like someone who refused to be ashamed. Clara spent most evenings in the kitchen, kneading bread or sewing by the window. James often passed by on his way to his study. He would pause for a heartbeat, wanting to say something. "Thank you, good night, are you happy?" But the words never came. One night, a storm rolled across the plains without warning. Thunder cracked like a whip and rain battered the windows. The ranch hands had gone home early, and the house stood eerily still except for the wind. Clara was in the kitchen, checking that every window was latched, when she noticed water seeping under the back door. She dropped to her knees, shoving an old towel against it. The next lightning flash revealed James standing in the doorway, soaked from head to toe, his hat dripping rain. "Fence broke near the south pasture," he said, voice hoarse. "Had to see the cattle through." "You'll catch your death," she said, rushing to grab a blanket. "I've caught worse." But his shivering betrayed him. Without thinking, Clara took his arm and pulled him toward the fire in the parlor. "Sit down. I'll get you dry," he hesitated. "You don't have to—" "I know I don't have to," she interrupted softly. "Let me—" James sat, dripping water onto the rug, watching as she fetched towels and stoked the fire higher. Her movements were brisk but gentle, practiced from years of caring for her father. When she handed him a towel, their hands brushed, just a fleeting touch, yet it sent warmth through both of them that had nothing to do with the fire. For a long while, neither spoke. The storm raged outside, but the room felt strangely peaceful. Clara broke the silence first. "I never asked. Why did you do it? Why marry me?" James looked into the flames, his jaw tightening. "Because I couldn't take your home and still call myself a man." He paused, then added quieter. "And because I saw something in you I thought I'd buried in myself, a will to keep fighting." Clara studied him, the flickering firelight softening his usually hard features. "You don't talk like a man people say you are. And you don't act like a woman who gave up her freedom," he replied. They both smiled faintly then, small, uncertain. but real. When the thunder faded, Clara poured him coffee, and they sat together by the fire until the storm moved on. No vows were spoken, no promises made, but when she rose to leave, James caught her wrist gently. "Clara," he said, his voice low, "you don't have to be afraid here." She looked down at their joined hands, her heart fluttering. "Maybe I'm not," she whispered. That night, as she lay in bed listening to the last drops of rain, Clara realized that something had shifted between them. The house didn't feel quite so cold anymore. The silence wasn't empty. It was waiting, and for the first time since she'd said, "I do," she began to wonder if this marriage might one day mean more than just a debt paid in vows. The peace that had begun to bloom between Clara and James. Callahan was fragile, like spring grass trying to grow in the middle of a drought. For a few brief weeks, the house felt different, softer. The walls no longer echoed with silence, but with the faint sounds of shared dinners, quiet conversations, and the gentle hum of something beginning to feel like belonging. But good things travel slowly on the plains, and gossip travels fast. It began in Dry Creek, whispered among the women at the mercantile and the men at the saloon. He married her to cover a scandal, some said. She tricked him, others muttered. By the time the story reached the Callahan ranch, Clara was being called the debt collector's bride, a poor girl who'd sold her name for land. Clara heard it first when she rode into town for supplies. The shopkeeper's wife gave her a tight, pitying smile. "You're a lucky girl, Mrs. Callahan," she said sweetly. "Not many men would marry a woman just to keep her off the streets." The words hit like a slap. Clara's cheeks burned as she turned away, pretending not to hear the chuckles behind her. When she returned to the ranch, she was quiet. James noticed, but he didn't press her. He wasn't the kind of man who asked questions easily, especially when he was wrestling with ghosts of his own. That night, however, she could no longer hold it in. "People in town are saying things," she said as they sat by the fire after supper. James looked up from the paperwork on his desk. "They always do. They think I married you for your money, that you pitied me." He set his pen down slowly. "Do you believe that?" Her voice shook. "I don't know what to believe. You never said why you really did it." James stared into the fire for a long time before answering, because it felt like the right thing to do. And maybe because I wanted to feel right about something again. The honesty in his tone should have comforted her, but instead, it made her ache. He hadn't said anything about love or even affection. Just guilt and duty wasn't enough to silence the town's cruel whispers. The next morning, Clara saddled a horse before dawn. She rode hard, back toward her old farmhouse. The place stood silent, the porch half collapsed, the garden wild. But it was hers in a way the big ranch house never could be. She sat on the steps, clutching her hands together. "Maybe they're right," she whispered to the wind. "Maybe I don't belong there." Hours later, James found her. He'd come alone, dust on his coat and worry etched deep into his face. He didn't shout or scold. He simply dismounted and walked up to her. "Clara," he said quietly, "you ran from me without saying a word." "I didn't run," she replied. "I came home. This is your home," he said firmly. "It's ours now." She looked at him then, really looked at him. The man who'd once been stone now looked tired, human, uncertain. "Why do you care?" she asked. "You've got everything. Why fight for someone like me?" James's voice broke slightly when he answered. "Because I've had everything, and it still felt like nothing. Until you stood in front of me and begged me not to take your home. That was the first time in years I felt something worth keeping." Clara's eyes filled with tears. She wanted to believe him, but part of her still feared she was only a memory he was trying to rewrite. He stepped closer, gently brushing a tear from her cheek. "Let them talk," he said. "They don't know what this is becoming." For the first time, Clara didn't pull away. The wind whispered through the grass around them. The land stretching wide and endless. The same land that had once divided them now slowly binding them together. And though doubt still lingered, Clara knew one thing. She wasn't alone anymore in her fight to belong. The next few days passed in uneasy quiet. After finding her at the old farmhouse, James had brought Clara home, but neither spoke much on the ride back. Something fragile had shifted between them again, like a door opened just enough to let the light in, yet both were afraid to step through. At the ranch, the rumors from town hadn't stopped. The ranch hands had heard the talk too, though they never repeated it in front of James. Still, Clara could feel their glances, their quiet respect tinged with curiosity. It made her feel like a stranger in her own life. One afternoon, as she hung laundry on the line, Mrs. Green, the kindly housekeeper, came out carrying a basket of folded linens. "Don't let town talk eat at you, dear," Mrs. Green said, her voice gentle. "Folk always find something to say when they can't understand kindness." Clara smiled faintly. "It's not just the talk. It's that I still don't know what I am to him. A wife on paper? A promise he's keeping?" Mrs. Green's eyes softened. "Maybe you should ask him instead of guessing from the shadows." That evening, Clara took her advice. James was in the barn, oiling his saddle, his sleeves rolled up, the scent of leather and hay thick in the air. The golden light of sunset poured through the open doors, painting him in hues of amber and dust. "James," she said quietly. He looked up. "Clara," his tone softened immediately. "You shouldn't be out here barefoot." "The floor's rough," she ignored the comment, her heart pounding. "I need to know something. Why did you really marry me?" James blinked, setting the rag aside. "I told you. I didn't want to take your home." "No," she pressed. "That was why you offered. But why did you go through with it? Why keep me here after all this time?" The air between them stilled. Outside, a breeze rustled the cornstalks, and a horse snorted softly in its stall. James stood, the weight of her question sinking into him. "Because somewhere along the way I stopped seeing it as charity." Clara's breath caught. "Then what is it?" He stepped closer, his voice rough but honest. "It's peace, Clara. When you're near, this place feels alive again. I come home and the silence doesn't bite the same way it used to. You fill the rooms my grief left empty." He paused, his eyes lowering. "I married you to give you a home, but it's me who found one." Her throat tightened, tears welling before she could stop them. "You never said that." "I didn't know how," he admitted. "I spent years thinking feelings made a man weak. But watching you fight for everything you love, you made me realize they make a man strong." Clara stepped closer, close enough to see the faint scar along his jaw, the weariness in his eyes that matched her own. "And what about love, James? Have you learned how to speak of that yet?" He hesitated, then took her hand gently in his. "I'm still learning, but I know this. I haven't felt something this true since the day I buried my wife. And when I thought you'd left me for good, I realized I couldn't lose you too." Her breath trembled. "So this, what we've been building, it's real?" "As real as the ground under our feet," he said quietly. For the first time since their wedding, Clara smiled, a small, genuine smile that reached her eyes. She squeezed his hand, her voice soft. "Then maybe I can stop running." James brushed a strand of hair from her cheek, his thumb lingering near her jaw. "You never had to run, Clara. You just had to choose to stay." And in that moment she did. Not because she owed him, not because she feared losing her home, but because, for the first time, she'd found where her heart truly belonged. Outside, the evening air cooled, and the ranch glowed in the fading light, no longer just his land, but their home. Autumn arrived softly that year, painting the fields in gold and rust. The Callahan Ranch, once a place of quiet labor and loneliness, now carried laughter on the wind. The change wasn't sudden. It grew slowly, the way wildflowers push through dry soil after rain. But it was real. For the first time since she'd come to this land, Clara felt she truly belonged. The whispers in town had faded. People still talked, as they always did, but now their words were softer, tinged with curiosity instead of scorn. When she walked into the mercantile, heads still turned, but not out of pity. Some even smiled, because they could see it. James Callahan had changed. He was no longer the stern, distant rancher who kept his grief locked behind stone walls. Now he worked alongside his men, spoke with warmth, and came home each evening with a quiet joy that showed in his eyes. And at home, Clara was no longer the girl afraid to touch anything for fear of being sent away. The house was alive again. Fresh curtains she'd sewn herself, flowers in the kitchen, and the smell of bread often wafting through the halls. But perhaps the greatest sign of change was the small room at the end of the hallway, what had once been the late Mrs. Callahan's sewing room. James had left it untouched for years, but one afternoon he found Clara there, carefully dusting the shelves. He froze at the doorway, memories flickering behind his eyes. "I'm sorry," Clara said quickly, lowering her head. "I shouldn't have—" He stopped her gently. "No, it's time." And together they began to clean it, slowly, reverently, transforming the space into something new. A nursery, it wasn't planned, but when Clara discovered she was expecting, the news filled the ranch with a quiet, glowing excitement. James was stunned at first, afraid to hope, but when she placed his hand on her growing belly one evening by the fire, something in him melted completely. "I don't deserve this," he whispered. She smiled softly. "Neither of us did. But we got it anyway." Their love had not been born of fairy tales or fleeting passion. It had been forged in hardship, misunderstanding, and second chances. Every trial they had faced, her fear of losing everything, his struggle to love again, had become the soil that grew something enduring. When winter came, snow blanketed the plains, turning the ranch into a world of white. The night their child was born, the fire burned bright, and the storm outside howled against the windows. But inside, there was warmth, light, and life. James held his newborn daughter in trembling hands, his eyes glistening. "She looks like you," he whispered. Clara, exhausted but smiling, shook her head. "She's stubborn like you already," he laughed, a sound Clara had never heard before, full and unguarded. "Then she's perfect." In that moment, the man who once believed his heart had died learned it could beat stronger than ever. And the woman who had once begged to keep her home realized she'd found something greater, a family. Weeks later, when the thaw began, the ranch hands saw a sight they'd never forget. James and Clara walking hand in hand through the fields, their baby bundled in Clara's arms. The wind played through her hair, and he looked at her with a gaze full of peace and pride. No longer the poor girl pleading for mercy. No longer the lonely rancher bound by grief. Just two souls who had lost everything once, and had the courage to build it all again, together. As the sun dipped below the western hills, James wrapped an arm around Clara and whispered, "You saved this land?" "You know." She looked up at him, her eyes bright. "No," she said softly. "We saved each other." And there, beneath the vast and endless sky, the home they built, on love, forgiveness, and faith, finally felt complete.